So thank you, Mark. So we can go ahead and dive into the meeting. The main piece on the agenda tonight is Stacy Greco's presentation on the MFLs for the Lower Santa Fe and Ichetucknee. Before we jump into that, has everybody had a chance to look at the agenda, and is there anything that anyone wants to add or amend or comment on? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get into it, Stacy? And I know there'll be a lot of discussion and comments, and a lot of people are curious to hear this presentation. So
sounds great. Thank you, everybody. I'm Stacy Greco. I know most of you, possibly all of you. I'm the Water Resources Program Manager, so Mark's counterpart at Alachua County EPD. And the presentation I'm going to give today is pretty much what I gave to the Joint Water Climate Policy Board in December of 2021. They wanted to know what was going on with the Lower Santa Fe and Ichetucknee MFL, and I had reached out to the water management districts to see if I could get someone to give a presentation there, because really it's a, this is a water management district project or regulation also through DEP. So this is, I'm just giving you this, it's through my lens with the Environmental Protection Department. And I know Bob Palmer's here and others that are really familiar with the MFL. So this is not the 101 MFL explaining the whole process and getting into the technical, because that could be a whole series of presentations. And I think what would be helpful for me, at least, is I presented what I'm going to present tonight to the Joint Water Climate Policy Board, which has 3 county commissioners, but we have 5 county commissioners. And I really have not presented on this in years because we're still waiting for that prevention and recovery plan, which is, in my mind, it's the biggest piece of the puzzle. It's, okay, what are we going to do about it? So at some point, hopefully during this year, that will come out and we'll get better direction as to what the Water Management District is proposing. And then at that point, I'll be updating the Board of County Commissioners to see, if they want to weigh in some means. So if anyone has thoughts on that at the end, that might be helpful. But with no further ado, I will share my screen.
Yeah, quick question.
Sure.
Yeah, has there been any kind of work at all demonstrated that they've done on this, on the prevention and recovery plan? I mean, like maybe a preliminary plan or discussion about what's going to be in it or anything at all?
They've been soliciting projects and they've had conversations. So as a result of a letter that we sent with some suggestions, I met with St. John's and Sewanee because, this basin, it impacts both, to discuss some of our ideas. So there's been discussions. I have not seen anything on paper. I know they're really looking for projects to be able to, increase recharge. And because of the length of time that it's taking to come up with it, my guess is that they're having a hard time coming up with those projects. And can you see just the one screen? You just see the one slide?
I see the one in the next.
Okay, so let me do this again. Okay, so now you just see the one?
There you go.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And I would say if you have questions at any time, please stop me and just ask. And I won't really see the chat. So Mark or Nishan, if you see something in the chat, just interrupt me.
Will do.
Okay, awesome. So minimum flows and levels is the establishment. The establishment of minimum flows and levels is required by state law. and they're developed by the water management districts, and then they're adopted by DEP. And since the watershed we are in is a groundwater watershed that also goes into St. John's, we have the pleasure of working with both water management districts and DEP. So I think that's part of why things take a long time with this basin. So MFLs set water levels and flows to prevent significant harm to the water resources or ecology from water withdrawals. So it's supposed to protect non-consumptive uses of water, and that would include things like navigation and recreation, fish, wildlife habitat, and for other natural resources, so for example, wetlands. So it's really designed to protect the natural system. So currently, so we're looking at the lower Santa Fe and the Ichetucknee rivers and their associated springs. So the Suwannee River Water Management District, which I'll probably end in 2014. And at that point, it was determined that the lower Santa Fe and the Ichetucknee rivers were determined to be in recovery. And what that means is that water levels were below the minimum flow and level that was needed to protect the ecology, and that consumptive use would need to be reduced to protect the resource. So in 2014, a recovery strategy was created, and it outlined projects and policies to meet that MFL. So now we're in the process of reevaluating the lower Santa Fe and the Ichetucknee rivers, part of which is because of some challenges, and the judge determined that it needed to be reevaluated once the new groundwater model was completed. So that's what triggered this, and we're in this reevaluation process. And the technical report came out in 2019. We contracted with a professional geologist, it was Sam Upchurch, to conduct a peer review because it was more technical than the staff we had on hand at that time to review it, and just staff time. His major concerns included limitations of the water use data used in determining the MFLs, lack of consideration for climate change, and then this assumption that a 15% harm or reduction to the water resource values is acceptable. So for example, if you were trying to protect wetlands, that a 15% harm or reduction is what you're shooting for. So just felt like there wasn't enough to back up why that number was selected. The district conducted their own peer review. They had 3 scientists, and the review team had 18 issues of significance that can directly and materially affect the proposed minimum flows and levels. So at this point, it's just you're arguing about, the document is about what is that level, right? Like how much water is needed in the system. So that's what this part of the MFL is. 2 of the reviewers did not find critical fault with the proposed MFLs, but the chair of that peer review did call for a redo of the MFL to address the water resource value process, but that was not done. So we moved forward, and then they did a status. So if they're going to move forward with, this is the minimum flows and levels that's needed, then you compare how is the resource doing compared to that level. So they published that status report in February of 2021 to compare the current and a 20-year planning horizon, so a 20-year projection, to that revised MFL to see how it was doing. And this little graphic here shows these are your possible outcomes. So red means you're not meeting your MFL. Yellow means you're meeting it in this current year, but you're projected to fall below that MFL within that 20-year planning. And green means the MFL is met and it's expected to still be met for the next 20 years. So when they did this reevaluation, the lower Santa Fe was considered to be in prevention, which means that the MFL is currently met, but expected to fall below that level within the next 20 years. So remember that in 2014, it was considered to be in recovery, and now it's prevention. So one could say that the system has improved. One could point that maybe it's the methods that are different. I think there's some different opinions out there of what that change is, but the district will say that, it's so close to being in recovery that they're really treating this Lower Santa Fe like it's in recovery, not prevention.
Did they actually give a year figure during which they expected it to fall below the MFL?
I'm not sure. That report came out in 2020, I think. That was the last time I read it. So I'm not sure if they gave an actual year, but it was they might have, but I think it was pretty close to, the 2020 year that they used to evaluate it. So I think that's why.
Within 5 years, maybe?
Perhaps, but I'd have to really look at the document to confirm. And then the Ichetucknee was still considered to be in recovery in the 2014 and in the 2019 status report. So at that point, we contracted again with Sam Upchurch, professional geologist, for him to do a peer review of the status assessment report to just see also, how did he feel about that? And again, he had concerns about the methods used in developing the MFL, and he referenced the more traditional methods used in developing the Upper Santa Fe River as an alternative method with less chance of error. And I believe that in the Upper Santa Fe, it was more using measured water use, measured water levels data rather than modeled. At that point, the district did not accept public comments on that status assessment report. I sent it to them, but it wasn't really one of those documents that was open for a public comment period. So the next step is for Suwannee to publish the draft recovery and prevention strategy to outline projects and policies for reducing consumptive uses and/or increasing water levels. The district is soliciting projects and regulatory suggestions for inclusion in the plan. I think they're still open to suggestions, and they're, I know they're even meeting with, different local governments and some of the nonprofit groups. So I think if anyone has an idea, consultants, that they'll consider it at this point. Doesn't mean it'll get, into the documents that then are, part of the regulatory process, but I think they are open to ideas. We did meet with Water Management District staff and sent a letter outlining some ideas, which I will go over. So some of the ideas that we provided, and obviously I will step back and say, at the county, what we focus on is urban water use. So when you look at this MFL, urban use is a big use, but so is agricultural use. But as local government, we don't have many tools to influence local government. So we're not really the best resource to provide that information on how to reduce that impact from agriculture. So, we provided more feedback on the urban water use, which, counties can have an influence on and more of an impact on. So really focused on some regulatory tools, which we have not seen too much of in these documents. So one idea is limiting landscape irrigation to 1 day a week year round. Right now it's once a week for about like a third of the year, a little bit less. And then most of the year you can be watering 2 days a week, even in the rainy season. And this happens in some areas of South Florida and Southwest Florida. Currently, right now, we are preempted by the water management districts to be able to have irrigation restrictions that are more restrictive than the district ones. Funding irrigation tune-ups and rebate programs to reduce wasteful landscape irrigation from existing systems. We are pilot testing tune-ups right now, and it's amazing what we find out there. We've been able to turn off a ton of systems and zones and reduce run times. We find most people's rainfall shutoff devices don't work. A lot of people have ghost programs, so every time it turns on, it's running twice. So I feel like there's a lot of savings there, but it's super staff intensive. So, or expensive if you're going to hire a consultant to do it. So it's not a cheap one. Require future development to meet water conservation standards, at least equivalent to Florida Water Star. That's a voluntary program for new construction. And, I think Florida Water Star, it's the best program that's out there right now, but I think it's still a baby step. It still allows a lot of irrigation. And our irrigation design code is based on Florida Water Star. So this wouldn't do much in Alachua County. But the idea here is, as we're starting to think about climate change, if we have more migration, especially into areas like your Columbia, your Gilchrist, where, land planning is not as, it's not as developed, or the plan is not as protective of our water as it is in Alachua County. So something like this, like just requiring all new development within the MFL area, could help reduce impacts from potential growth. Go ahead.
There's a question, Stacy, in the chat from Melissa Hill. Is the preemption of local government to limit the number of days to irrigate something that just the water management district has, or was that preemption made at the state level?
It's actually in the water management district rules. So they could do a rule change, and then that would allow them to consider like different restrictions. So it's first they have to do a change that then they'll consider them, I think, on a case-by-case basis. It came up about, maybe in 2012. I remember going to a St. John's governing board meeting where we were asking for this, and it was a definitely not, was the answer we got at that time. I think things are shifting. There's some staff over there that's, helping to talk about these types of ideas also. So I think that the time might be coming that we'll be able to move forward with that.
Thanks, Stacy. And just to clarify, is that just the St. John's or also the Swanee? Is it district-wide, I guess, like all the districts?
So that's a great question. Really, it's St. John's. A lot of times, so in our area, we have the pleasure of being within both districts. And, like St. John's actually does the consumptive use permits for GRU, even though the wells are within Swanee. So there's a lot of things are deferred to St. John's. I don't know what that official agreement is, but I know St. John's has said no, and I definitely do not want to have different rules for part of the county. We had that for a long time before Swanee adopted the same restrictions as St. John's. I had this crazy map of what restrictions applied where, and it was very challenging to communicate. So I think that whatever we do, we'd have to get St. John's on board, and I believe we'd be able to get Swanee to follow suit. We'd have to probably do some type of memorandum or some type of like resolution that gives the authority to St. John's to do that.
Interesting. Thanks for that background.
Requiring utilities to implement more aggressive tiered pricing and or water budgets. GRU has some great data that when they applied more aggressive tiered rates, really saw a drop in water use. So while actually all of the utilities in Alachua County have tiered pricing, it would be great to have some of this stuff be district wide so that we're making sure that it's happening everywhere, even outside of Alachua County. Prohibiting landscape irrigation wells when potable or reclaimed water is available. This is especially important if you're gonna do more aggressive tiered pricing, because as you get higher water bills, it becomes more attractive to install an irrigation well. And right now people can do that. And we're actually seeing that because GRU just made some changes to their billing. that some of those really high water users are seeing it in their bill. And I, I've seen a couple go through some permits for people putting in irrigation wells, and we're not allowed to. There's actually this one is at the legislature level. There are some preemptions that we can't add any extra fees or any undue regulation. We can't duplicate in any way, and we can't get involved with wells. I think this one, I'm not as hopeful that we'll be successful with this one in the near future. And the challenge with this also is that it really creates an uncertainty in the water use data. So when you look at the USGS compiles water use data, and in a lot of those reports, as we start to see that public supply go down, one of the theories as to what's happening there, I'd love to pat myself on the back and say it's all the water conservation programming I'm doing, but one of the theories is that it's more people shifting to irrigation wells that then are no longer accounted for. Because when you're doing that, big level water estimate, if someone's on potable, you're assuming, that's the water they're using. You're not also assuming that they have a well. So it's unaccounted for water in that water supply planning.
Stacey, is this residents or businesses that are doing this primarily?
It's residents, but we also do see it in common areas of neighborhoods. I am not so sure on businesses. I do know, some apartment complexes will have a well for irrigating.
And what kind of property, what size property are they doing that for?
I mean, some of them are, just your general single family residential house. But if you're,
And they're putting in wells for that.
they're irrigation wells, so they're a small well. But it's another straw.
Yeah. I'm just amazed that they would spend the money to have have someone put in a well for them.
Yeah, well, they did. If you run the numbers, and there used to be, when Turnberry Lake was developed, in their visitor center, there was a display there. I never saw it, but I heard about it from several people. But supposedly there was a display there where a well driller had done the numbers and showed people, the return on investment. And it was something like 4 or 5 years. So if you're a new homeowner buying this home that you plan to retire in, and you want that lush landscape, why not?
Yeah.
So where we're at, so DEP is now getting involved in doing the rulemaking, and they're holding several workshops and releasing part of the MFL process at each meeting. It's like waiting for Netflix for your next season to come out. And they're collecting public comment along the way. So the first workshop was in October of 2021, and that really addressed the proposed MFL. And I attended that workshop and provided some public comments, and then followed up with some written comments. Then they had a second workshop in December. We attended that one virtually, and then also provided some comments. I did hear from district staff that he is planning the next one in the next couple months, and that one might focus more on some of the projects and recovery plans. I will say that whenever I'm talking with the state about how they plan to meet the MFL, I hear the word projects a lot, which I would like to hope, I'd like to see some regulatory measures be in there also. So what's next? I'm continuing to monitor. I will provide feedback on the MFL to the Board of County Commissioners. Been kind of waiting for that last piece of the puzzle, the prevention and recovery plan. Water supply planning in the basin is also happening, and we are partnering with our growth management staff, and we've been providing comments so far. They just had some of the draft preliminary assumptions that they're making, and we provided some comments on that. We're trying to review consumptive use permits in Alachua County. We don't have a say in what happens with them, but at least in St. John's, I'm on a list where I get notified, and I'm just starting to just look at them a little bit more to just better understand. So for example, one came through a couple months ago, and it was for an apartment complex in Gainesville. So I went to the apartment complex and walked around, and it was a small permit, but it was all for landscape irrigation, and their landscape was all established. So really it didn't even need to be irrigated. And I'm starting to wonder, you know, if you look at all of those little permits, they really add up to be a lot. Like, how do we start to ratchet down, you know, all of those small permits and not just go after these big permits? But so far, I haven't really seen an appetite for ratcheting back use that's already been allocated. We're applying for funding to expand our irrigation tune-up and retrofit program. We're also working on some potential code changes. This has nothing to do with the MFL, but I think I had this in here because I needed to update some commissioners, so I'll update you also. We hope to update our landscaping code this year with stakeholder engagement happening very soon. One thing we're considering is requiring soil amendments for new development. And I know that you guys spoke with Life Soils at your last meeting. So, you know, that's an example of a soil amendment. We have the University of Florida on contract right now. They're currently evaluating various amendments. We just want to make sure that, you know, the different products that have different feedstocks. So if one has biosolids, one has animal waste, that we're not creating any other issues and having any of the emerging contaminants causing any issues. So we got preliminary results. We should get the final results in April for that, and that will help us inform policy to the board. We're also evaluating.
Give us an update when that time comes, Stacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
We'd
you.
love some feedback. We're evaluating policies to encourage or require more protection of existing vegetation during new construction. And then we're also evaluating our irrigation design code that was adopted back in 2016 so that we can see how we're doing. And if we're not saving as much water as we hoped, I mean, really the code was a baby step. Is it time to ratchet it up and start to try other methods to get reduced use from those landscape irrigation, which is one of our largest uses in the county? So in conclusion, we know there's overconsumption in the basin and water use needs to be reduced or recharge needs to be increased to reverse impacts and prevent new ones. And EPD and our consultant has concerns with the MFL and the status report. And at this point, we feel the best option is just to continue to engage with the state and to push for, you know, an aggressive prevention and recovery plan and see how much, you know, we can get in there. So that's all I have prepared. I'm sure there's questions and thoughts, and I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Stacy. Who would like to go first with questions?
I just have one question about how they arrived at the MFLs this time versus last time. If you can describe what they did this time and what was the difference.
That is a great question. Well, this time it uses the I forget the name of the new model, the North Florida Regional Groundwater Supply Model. So it uses that model, which went through years and years of development. And I think it includes South Georgia in it. So I think that's the biggest difference, that it includes that model, but I'd have to go back. Now you're asking me to go back to 2019 when the MFL first came out.
Stacy, do you mind if I say just a couple things there?
Please do it. Is that Scott?
Okay. Yeah, it's Scott.
Thank you.
So yeah, the model is NEFSEG is kind of the shorthand for it. It's North Florida, South Georgia. It's a giant regional groundwater model. It actually extends like way up into Georgia. So they did use that for a lot of the groundwater modeling. They also are kind of constantly refining. So Stacy touched on, like, they look at various environmental and recreational criteria. They're constantly refining the techniques for those, but there are 10 of what are called water resource values. And they go through those kind of one by one. Some of the changes that happen in a lot of these updates is not all of those 10 are easily evaluated. Ichetucknee is actually somewhat unique in that it's one of the places where the recreational one has received quite a bit more attention than in most spring systems, because there is a big recreational aspect there. But it's kind of like for each one of those water resource values, they do a variety of, I mean, they have to have data. So they're kind of constantly doing data collection for these, but then they do a variety of modeling. So some of those are surface water models and like riverine models, looking at, you know, depth of flow at under various flow conditions. So how deep the system is, that's very important from the standpoint of like fish passage, human passage, manatee passage. But so they kind of go through each one of those water resource values and use the tools that are available. A lot of those water resource values, there aren't great tools for, to be completely honest, but maybe that's a little more help.
Yeah, and this one too, they did add a gauge. So there were 3 compliance gauges that they were using in 2019, and in 2014, I believe there was just 2. So there's definitely some changes. It's a pretty dense report. MFLs are very challenging to wrap your brain around. And if you step away from it for a couple of years, you lose it.
How good is the science that they're using though to determine those resource values? I mean, from what Scott just said, it's not that good, and some of them at least aren't that good.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend looking at the peer review. You know, you can look at what Sam Upchurch did for us and what the peer reviews did for the district.
And David, I would say it's not. Some of the science and modeling is extremely challenging. I'd say actually the bigger problem in most of these systems is that there's not a lot of data, especially not a lot of old data. So, you know, you have models, but it's challenging to calibrate models if you don't have long-term data sets and, you know, good water quality data and other information like that. So I'd say it's possibly more of a, if you don't have the data to do great modeling, it's hard to come up with good results.
Okay. Are they doing their best to make up for that in the future?
They tend to collect a lot of data every time they're doing an update for, you know, several years before in a lot of cases. I mean, the volume of data that's been collected for a lot of these MFLs is pretty staggering. You know, that it then feeds into models, and you know, models are only as good as their inputs, tends to be the case. But it's very challenging. Like it's not an easy problem at all. And like Stacy said, I mean, they are incredibly dense. I would be lying if I said I understood the entirety of this MFL, and I've looked at it in quite a bit of detail.
Yeah, it's very challenging. And I will say I have seen, you know, I monitor the district's governing board agendas. I have seen several projects where they're awarding funds to different consultants to collect more data and to try to get a better understanding. So I do think that they are trying to have a better understanding. And this is where it's challenging for me, because we could spend all night here fighting about, you know, where that number should be and what it means. Whereas I always want to move the conversation into, let's just assume we're using too much. So let's reduce our use as much as we can and or increase recharge as much as we can. And let's have the conversation be focused there, because I think regardless of how you feel about if the MFL is set correctly, the bottom line is there's overconsumption. But I mean, I guess, you know, it is important to know, well, how much do you have to reduce by? But
well, how do we gauge that? I mean, is there, you know, I once asked if there is any gauging of the aquifer to know whether, you know, that level of fresh water, you know, that's in the aquifer is going down or not, and I was told there wasn't.
well, I mean, we've got lots of wells. You know, you go and you monitor a ton of wells at the same time, and then you do a potentiometric map that shows you where your aquifer levels are.
Yeah, but the aquifer level is going to go up as the fresh water is used to meet the, so it's always going to be tend to be close to or moving towards the same level, if not at the same level.
There's
Because
some
the salt water
variability.
underneath is going to come up as the fresh water goes away.
It's not that simple, David.
Okay.
I mean, if you have places that have like substantial pumping, you see very clear cones of depression in the potentiometric surface. And I mean, like right now we're in a particularly wet period. And so groundwater levels are very high at a lot of their long-term gauging stations. And during very dry periods, they drop a lot. So there are big changes. I mean, water does flow from areas with higher potentiometric levels to areas of lower potentiometric levels.
Mm-hmm. My point was, is that if you left the system alone and didn't pump anything for, say, a couple of years, wouldn't all the wells tend to be at the level that we would say that the aquifer is full, and we know that's not really true?
So, I mean, like the springs are one of the clear discharges that exist all the time. And so even before there would have been human impacts on the aquifer, spring flow would have varied with levels in the aquifer. So I mean, if you turned off all pumping tomorrow, groundwater levels would come up, but spring flow would increase to the point where the two stayed in balance.
So spring
It's
flow
not
should
like-
be our indicator, right? Not necessarily the level of even rivers and spring or rivers and other water sources.
It's definitely an important indicator. And I mean, Swanee River collects a lot of spring flow data, I think probably as much or more than a lot of the other districts. They also have an unbelievable number of springs in their district. So it's, yeah,
And they're dynamic.
it's very challenging.
They're
Yeah.
dynamic, you know, like, I mean, just by observation, you know, they're just they're different under different conditions, and, you know, we can't just turn pumping off. So yeah, it is.
My point was basically, it seems like we could actually just run at the same level. The aquifer, we could actually pump at a level where the aquifer appeared to be about the same level, and yet still run out of water.
I don't think I'm understanding.
I'm saying, I think that if we kept pumping at this level where more water is coming out of the aquifer than is going in, and therefore the amount that is flowing through the springs is being lowered and lowered and lowered, that while it might appear as if the aquifer were staying at approximately the same level, we could still run out of fresh water as that water then turned to salt water.
I mean, so the potentiometric surface, so the reason that wouldn't happen, and I'm not saying pumping can't literally cause springs to stop flowing. I mean, that's the case down at, Kissingen Springs is the very famous example in Florida. Right. That being said, the potentiometric surface in the area, in the Santa Fe area is 50, 60, 70, 80, maybe 90 feet above sea level. Mm-hmm. So saltwater can't just come in to fill that up. If you see what I'm saying, because there are 70 feet of fresh water sitting on top of it.
Right. You might have more of that in the coastal areas, but in here, I think we would see wells go dry before.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah. And I see Melissa has her hand up.
Hey, fantastic presentation. Thank you all so much. My question is with the current MFL and status report, as well as the prevention and recovery plan. I know with the last MFL, there was a decent amount of litigation ongoing. Is that still the case for any of these documents and studies, or is it just kind of into planning mode?
Yeah, so I think it's that everything is still being developed. I think once DEP gets done with their rulemaking and then, it's official, this is what they're wanting to adopt. This is the recommendations. I think at that point in time, we might see challenges from, various places. I mean, you can get it from multiple places, right? I mean, you could get environmental groups thinking that it doesn't go far enough. You could get it from utility groups that think it goes too far. It could be from local government that thinks their assets aren't protected. So we're not at that point yet. There's nothing really to legally challenge yet with this revised MFL.
Thanks.
Mhm. That's your cue, huh, Bob? I saw you turned your camera on.
My camera's been on. I don't know
Oh,
why.
sorry.
I don't know why it queued me up. I think Nishi may have done it. I can comment if you want, but I'll let the other the actual board members go first.
I have one question. I'm a little unclear what it means. The assumption that a 15% harm or reduction to the water resource values is an acceptable threshold. What does that mean? 15% harm or reduction?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it, and then if anyone else has anything to add. So those are those resource values that Scott was mentioning. There was 10 of them used in this MFL. So like recreation, for example. So if you're using data that shows, you need X amount of water to have tubing and to have kayaking and canoeing. So if you really need, just for the numbers to say you need 100 CFS or something to have that. So then they're saying 15% reduction is acceptable. So, okay, you can have 85 CFS. So it's saying that, you can reduce those parameters, but then it's still like meeting its designated use, that's okay. So it's saying that we're not going to have 100%, but 85% is okay.
Can I provide one
Yes.
little
Thank
just
you.
added? Yeah, so it is kind of water resource value by water resource value. And so, fish and wildlife passage is one of the water resource values. And so in that case, if a system has, let's say, both fish in it, but then also manatees, they may look and they may build a model for the river that essentially lets them look at the depth in the river under various flows. And so they'll look at the flow record that they have and they'll say, okay, based on the flows in this system, manatees are able to access the head spring 150 days based on what historic flows looked like. And so they may be able to say, based on that, we are allowed to have a 15% reduction in the number of days that manatees are able to access that system. And so it used to be 150, and it would now be 150 minus 15%.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And so it would no longer be 150 days, it would be 127 or something like that days.
Okay, and then the
Which is
flow
a
minimum flow level would be,
15% decrease.
and the minimum flow
It's-
level would be set at that 15% decrease.
So it's not a literal 15% decrease in flow. It's a 15% loss in the water resource value. And so it's
Okay.
very much like a bank shot in pool here. It is not nice and linear in general.
Right.
It's definitely more like, so on the Ichetucknee, a flow of 100 CFS may allow tubers to go through an area, let's say. And so they may look at the long-term record and they say, okay, we had 100 CFS here 300 days a year. So there were 65 days a year historically that flow did not occur in this specific location. Hence, tubers were only able to use that section of river 300 days a year. They would then say, okay, we're allowed to have a 15% decrease in the frequency at which tubers can use that section of the river. That works out to another lost 45 days of tubing in that case. And so now they would say, okay, we only have to have a sufficient flow 255 days instead of 300 days. And so you get into this, they then back calculate the flow that the flow pattern that allows them to get 255 days of passage. This is why these MFLs are so complex. It is,
Yeah.
you look at the charts and you're like, okay, so I need to think forward and then backward to figure out how this chart reads. But
Right.
it's essentially a 15% loss in the specific water resource value resource and the
Okay.
frequency of use of that. I mean, there are, I literally heard in a meeting some time ago, someone who had supposedly been around kind of at the creation of this, and they pretty much said they had pulled that number out of thin air. It has generally been applied. My guess is someone was like, how about 20%? And they probably said like, oh, that seems a little bit too high. And someone said, how about 10%? Well, that seems a little bit too low. And they ended up at 15.
And this
But
is,
that's what
this is a fifth.
that's what someone implied.
Okay, so it was kind of arbitrary, and this 15% reduction to water resource values is based on historical values before the water system was in recovery status, right? Like it's not a 15% reduction from the already recovery status flows.
Correct.
Okay.
It's so complex. And this is why when I'm standing in front of the elected officials, I don't want to have to get into all this, but this is a good reminder that I do need to brush up on all of it and potentially have the district there so that they can answer all the questions on their MFL. I can just talk about the policies.
Yeah, it would be nice. I mean, I guess it's kind of unavoidable for the language to get very convoluted because the problem is complex, but it would be nice if there was a more public facing friendly way to talk about this stuff so that people could be kind of more aware of what's going on.
You know, they had a good frequently asked questions document on the MFL website that I thought did a good job. I mean, not getting into like the nuance that we're getting into, but at least like, what does it mean? What are the implications? It was out of date and I requested that they update it because they had really like answered it in relation to like the Nestle permit, because that's what they were getting so much content, so many citizens were reaching out about that, but I don't know if it's been updated, but that was a pretty good, that frequently asked questions on their website.
Okay, I'll check that out. I think George is next with a question.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. I have a question, Stacy, but before I ask a question, would you mind unsharing your presentation? I'm seeing your conclusion slide.
I would be happy to. How's that?
Yeah, there you go. Now we can see some people. I wanted to see Bob when he talks. So
George.
Hey, I'm wondering, Stacy, in the analyses that goes on between these MFLs and adjustments and everything, if there's a part of this is an analysis, if something is improving, what is driving the improvement? Is it incentive programs? Is it regulations? Is it projects? Is that happening so that they, obviously the result would be you can focus on things that seem to work and drop the spending money on stuff that may not? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, all projects that are funded by the districts, you do have some reporting requirements as someone that has a ton of grants. A lot of those are estimates. They did a prevention recovery plan in the 2014 that you would think if you were now in the process of having to update that's where you would start, right? What did you ask for in 2014 and how are those performing? I had a couple projects in that 2014 doc that were listed in there. No one has reached back out to me to find out how they're doing, although I do send some quarterly reports on one of them. So I don't know. It's a great question. And unfortunately, it can be quite difficult to tease apart, if something's improving, what's happening, because we always have all of these things happening. And then we also have, we've had a lot of rain. We've had, some pretty wet years. Also, there's a different method that they're using between this one and that one. that sometimes it can be difficult to correlate our actions to then the response we're seeing in the environment. But you would at least think that with projects, you know, because when you're getting funding, you estimate, this is what I think it's going to do, that there be some monitoring and evaluation, although some of those aren't quick, right? You know, with our irrigation design code, we started in 2016. It's now 2022, and we now finally have enough data that we can start to evaluate it with, you know, real water use data, not just estimates. But I'm writing that down as a good thing to bring up with the water management districts. And I don't know if anyone else knows of any validation they're doing in that way.
Well, I guess, you know, projects and so forth have reports and everything. And it just seems to me that there should be somebody who's, you know, spearheading these projects that would, you know, obviously there's a report somewhere, I would hope, and somebody needs to be reading these reports. It was a major challenge all my career with all these grant projects, and you write in, you know, detailed reports, and I bet I can count on one hand how many times the agency or the regulator actually seemed like they were using the results. Because, and the reason I say that is because over the years after that, you know, there's similar projects doing the same thing, funded over and over and over again. So anyway, I just was curious, you know, if in the whole process here, there is some kind of an analysis of what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, and I have to say, it does worry me a little bit, just because, you know, when you're applying for funding, you oftentimes, you know, will make estimates, and it's kind of best case scenario. You're trying to sell this project, and then, you know, a lot of times what happens in projects is you don't get the best case scenario conditions. So we might not be achieving what we set out to achieve, but then if that estimated number got put into a model or into a spreadsheet where you were trying to like consolidate where you were going to get, you know, these improvements, someone needs to loop back around and change that number to a more accurate one. So it's very important. I didn't know if Melissa's hand is still up or if that was from last time.
I actually had a follow-up to what Nisha was asking about, which, so with that 15% allowed, does that then mean that the next time an MFL gets calculated, that the allowed reduction essentially compounds? So then the next round of calculations in your model with the data that you're using, so during that period of the MFL with an allowed 15% reduction, that then moving forward, the historical number keeps getting lower for what the MFL has been over the time period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And I don't think it would, because that's really, you know, the manatees need that water, you know, and that's not going to change. So it's really kind of that 15% reduction is kind of before the pumping is there. It's how much do they need? So that should not be cumulative, right? Like reducing it by 15% each time. No.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that would be bad math if it was.
One little note on that is very often the flow reductions that are allowed are actually a lot less than 15%.
The flow reduction, right? Because we're really looking at the resource value reduction. Yeah. If
Thank
only
you.
it was linear. So now that everyone's thoroughly confused, it's complicated. And, you know, you are a group of people that, you know, understand water issues and, you know, spend your time thinking about these things sometimes. So then going out to the general public and elected officials that, you know, need to know about everything in our county, not just water. It's a challenging thing. I need to find a good way to present it that is accessible. But and it's hard, you know, because I don't really want to get into the details of the MFL because it is so complex to explain, and I'm not sure how much change we can create with that. I feel like we're at this point that we can possibly be applying pressure that that recovery plan has aggressive strategies in it. But I feel like the MFL has been set, it hasn't been adopted. But at this point in time, I haven't seen them going back and changing it, you know, since it was, you know, they first published this round. So I think it would have to be, you know, a legal challenge or something that would change that, unless they get enough public outcry. But I don't know that the public, enough people would be able to comment on something like the specific as to what should the MFL be set at.
I have a couple of questions, Stacy, about the recommendations from Alachua County EPD. So I'm looking at the letter, I guess, from Stephen Hofstetter, and are the recommendations kind of more or less in order of importance or efficacy? The landscape irrigation being like the first one on the list, or are they just kind of all just randomly sorted?
Yeah, so probably not ranked, and that's the November 16th letter.
Yes.
Okay. And I will say, like I said, you know, our recommendations really focus a lot on landscape irrigation, because that's what, you know, we have the expertise to be able to make recommendations on. I'm not who the district, you know, I can make a general comment that I think, you know, we should have less water use in agriculture, but I don't know how to get there. So
Gotcha.
not saying that landscape irrigation is the only thing needed in this basin. I mean, we really need to reduce use from all of the sources. And
Okay.
yeah.
And then in terms of, have you seen recommendations from other counties or other organizations? And is there overlap in the recommendations, or is everybody kind of throwing out completely different ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, you know, it's public comment, you know, so it's hard to see what people, you know, Bob did share his responses to me on that, I think on that first or second MFL workshop. And I think I might have even grabbed a couple of his ideas and expanded on them. I know I shared mine with the Ichetucknee Alliance and the Florida Springs Council. So I think there's some sharing. It's, for me, I found the whole process a little frustrating in that the timeline has not been clear to me. So it's sometimes hard to focus and organize when you're not quite sure what your timeline is, and, you know, what's the next piece that's going to get released to review. And sometimes we don't see that piece until a day or two before the agenda, but I mean, before the meeting for the MFL workshop. And I would be curious if it's appropriate to hear Bob Palmer's thoughts.
Yeah, is that all right, Nisha? Or are there
Oh, yeah,
members of the, are there other members of the committee that have additional questions? If not, I'll make a few comments. George, you're still on, aren't you?
You're muted,
There he
George.
is.
Sorry, I'm muted.
Yeah,
Yep.
quickly, there's
I'm
so
here,
much.
Bob.
Okay, great. There's so much to unpack here. Just quickly, and George raised a good point about evaluation of projects. And we're talking about an MFL, but obviously there's a parallel process dealing with water quality, and that's the BMAP process. If you look at a BMAP document, there's scores or hundreds of projects in there that are funded by the state. And I know a while back I called a lady named Trina Vilhauer, who's the lady at DEP who's in charge of all their springs projects. And I asked Trina, I said, Trina, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of these hundreds of projects that you funded that are supposedly going to help us meet the BMAP goals? And she said, we don't. They don't. They fund them and they hope they work. But there is absolutely no process at all for evaluating them. So Ryan Smart, who's director of the Florida Springs Council, and I wrote a piece of legislation last fall, and it's actually part of it is moving through the Florida Senate right now and may well get adopted. It's called the Blue-Green Algae Task Force Implementation Act. And one of the provisions in there is that any project that costs over $1 million, you've got to have a written report on the efficacy of that project. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. That's kind of a sidelight of what I really wanted to say, but thank you, George, for bringing that up. I think you were right on target with that question. But, you know, I'm a former EPAC member. And when I'm in a meeting like this, I always think, well, what should EPAC be doing on this? And I think, you know, Stacy's obviously come up with a very good program for trying to nudge the districts and nudge the commission into doing some very logical things. And I think EPAC can very easily support everything I heard Stacy talking about today. But I think the real question for EPAC that you guys should consider, and it's not a trivial task to get smart on this. I think the real question for EPAC is, do you want to recommend that the county challenge this MFL? And Stacy stated it properly. There may be groups challenging it. There may not be. The county has the resources to challenge it. And you look at some of these little groups out there, you know, that have $2,000 and $3,000 and $5,000 in the bank. They don't really have the resources to challenge it. I was on the team that challenged the Rainbow MFL, which was the last MFL for a Springs region that's been challenged. That was challenged in 2018. And there's a very good, super active group down there called Rainbow River Conservation, Inc., RRC, Inc. President is a former professor named Bert Eno, great guy. He's in his mid-80s. He's got more energy than any of us. And we had, I guess, 4 days of hearings in Tallahassee in front of an administrative law judge challenging them, that MFL, both on the science and on the regulatory portions of it. And, you know, these judges, how can I state this, you know, in a respectful way? The judges are idiots. That's about as respectful as I could get. I'd urge anyone that's really thinking about this seriously, like, should we try to challenge? Should we recommend challenge? Go pull up, it's easy enough to find it on the Division of Administrative Hearings. Pull up the Rainbow MFL challenge from 2018. Read the proposed order that our side wrote. Read the proposed order that Southwest Florida Water Management District wrote, and read the judge's findings on it. The science down there was flawed. The regulatory strategy was flawed. The judge went along with the state, and RRC Inc. decided not to appeal it, although it could have been appealed to the District Court of Appeals. Nestle was mentioned earlier. Just I'll mention in passing quickly that the Nestle permit is still being challenged. It's now being challenged by Florida Springs Council. And that case is at the First District Court of Appeals, and it's not over yet. What we're really trying to do is get to the heart of the matter, which is the public interest prong of water permitting. There's 3 prongs in any water permit. The third prong being the public interest, which is rarely, if ever, considered in these permits. So I think you guys, it would involve a lot of work. But I think a role that EPAC could play is advising the county commission on whether or not the county ought to expend time, resources, and money in challenging this. And I would say there's 2 aspects. The first is the science. This is a graph I did a few months back, and this shows probably the wrong way, but it shows decadal by decades flow in the Santa Fe River. And you see those last 4 dots are sort of plummeting downward. This is not a year by year. This is decade by decade. So those are long-term trends. What you see if you read this MFL is there's actually no data in this MFL on long-term river flows, which is absurd. And the reason is because the flows have been going down, 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 down. If you talk to Scott's daddy, Dr. Robert Knight, I think and they just finished a 2-year study of the Santa Fe River. I think Dr. Knight's conclusion is the flow in the Santa Fe River in recent years, and Scott can correct me, is down something like 25 to 30% over historical levels. So when we talk about the water resource values, as you did earlier, and the comment was made, well, the water resources can be reduced 15%, but they have not reduced the flows by 15% in their actual MFL recommendation. That's true. What they say is an acceptable reduction in flow, however, is from a historical baseline that many of us would argue is totally miscalculated. So they take they say the historical baseline is down here somewhere, and we're going to take 5% below that. And gee, that's not bad. It's only 5%. The real issue is the historical baseline really here rather than down here where the district says it is? In the Rainbow case, Dr. Knight actually produced an alternative model for flow in the Rainbow River, testified on it for about a day. His deposition, which I attended with Bob, lasted 9 hours. But, in the end, the judge said, well, Dr. Knight's model sounds pretty good. The district model sounds pretty good. I'm just an ignorant judge. I don't know the difference. So I'm just going to go with the districts. Is essentially what he said. We sat through 4 days of hearings with that judge. He never asked a single question. So that's the science side. The regulatory side, which is when this MFL was challenged in 2014, the Santa Fe MFL, there was a challenge to it in 2014. They challenged basically the regulatory portion of that MFL, and they were unsuccessful. It was Ichetucknee Alliance, and I can't remember what other group was involved, but the challenge was not successful. The district then implemented a regulatory policy, which did absolutely nothing. You can go read it. But that regulatory policy has been in place for the Santa Fe and the Ichetucknee for the last 7 years, and it hasn't done anything. In fact, pumping has increased and flow has decreased. So the question is, what's the regulatory strategy going to be this time around? Stacy didn't go into it, but there is a good chunk of that regulatory policy which has been published, and you can read it online, and it actually sounds a lot tougher than the one that's currently in place. It essentially says, if you're going to get a new permit or you're going to increase your existing permit, you have to offset it somewhere. Now, if I can really believe that, that's pretty tough. I think they could go further, but that's far tougher than what they're doing now. The first test of that I saw was there's an industrial development in Lake City called the Mega Industrial Site. Stacy, I don't know if you're aware of that, but it's 2.1, 2.2 million gallons a day for a site in Lake City where they're hoping to attract some clients to come in and do whatever that's going to require significant water use. So it was a request by Columbia County for that permit. Swanee approved that permit within the last month. It's a new permit. And their story was, we're going to offset that entire 2 million gallon withdrawal. And Scott I haven't had the opportunity to have a briefing on this, and Scott would know much more about it than I would, but apparently there are a couple of existing wells near a lake up in Columbia County. And their pitch is that we're going to use these existing wells, I guess, to decrease the evaporation rate on that lake and thereby save 2.1 million gallons a day. It sounds kind of flaky to me. And the question is, how many of these wells are out there that could actually serve to create all this new water. So I think there's real problems with this MFL. I don't believe they're baseline. There was a lot of talk here about water resource values. Our judge and another administrative law judge said that in any challenge, we can't challenge the water resource values as part of our challenge. That has to be done in a separate hearing in front of DEP. So that kind of defangs any arguments one can make about inadequate water resource values, but there's still a potential role here for the county. I know the county's set aside a bunch of money to look at this MFL and probably set aside money for attorney fees. Stacy would know, obviously, that. So there is an option the county could wade in and challenge this. And if EPAC is up to the task, you guys could take a serious look at this thing and decide whether you want to make that recommendation to the county. I think it's worth your time. I don't think it's worth your time to try to parse every little thing Stacy's doing, because I think it's so solid. You could just write a letter and say, yeah, do what Stacy says. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of value added from what EPAC can do in that regard, but there would be value added in either recommending or not recommending they go ahead with the legal challenge. And I think we kind of know enough now. We know the science, we know the MFL, we know what it says. We've got a good chunk of the regulatory strategy that's already been published. And the time for a challenge would be after DEP finalizes the rule, but before it's approved by the legislature, because this rule will have to be approved by the legislature. But that would be in 2023 at the earliest. So there is some time between when DEP presumably approves this rule and when the legislature approves this rule, when a challenge may be brought. The obvious groups to bring a challenge would be Ichetucknee Alliance and our Santa Fe River Inc. And maybe the Sierra Club. Those would be the only groups that I could see that would bring a challenge, other than, as Stacy pointed out, maybe some utility groups would challenge it from the other end. And they've got a lot more lawyers and a lot more money to make their arguments. And in fact, they've already surfaced in some of these meetings. So anyway, those are some thoughts. Happy to entertain any comments or questions on them. Thank you, Anisha.
Thank you, Dave, Bob. I think David has his hand up. Oh,
But
you're
not his
muted,
microphone.
David.
Yeah, first I have a comment to make, and that's that I've read the MFL that he's discussing about the Rainbow River, and I've also read some BMAPs and other documents and in legal cases that have, people have put up against the state. And these judges are ruling on absolutely incredibly dumb, and obviously non-scientific, cases by the state, and yet they still lose. Okay. So, I mean, it's insane. I mean, I just, I'm almost dubious to the point of saying, well, what would actually work? I mean, obviously we've got to try and slow them down. We did, for what it's worth, put together, a request to the county before, a recommendation that they, bring an action against the state if the time came, such that it was demonstrated that they weren't going to come through with a good MFL, and indeed they haven't. So I think that may be in time to consider doing that. My real question is whether what makes more sense, challenging the MFL or the prevention and recovery status. And based upon what you just said, it sounds like the recovery and the prevention and recovery planning that they have at least a preliminary on is pretty sound. I mean, we'd be hard pressed, to come up with a better one. On the other hand, setting the baseline of flow for historical level for the river is the main thing, right there. If you set that too low, you could actually get to the point where, you had no flow at all in the river, and say, well, that's how it was traditionally, or historically. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much of a chance there is even fighting that when these judges all turn around and say, to the best of legal cases, I mean, ones where there's 100 good legal points, again, the state having none, you know, and they're being called to task for every stupid argument they've made, every non-mathematical, you know, argument that doesn't add up, and every non-scientific, you know, argument they make. And then the judges still award the cases to the state. So I'm concerned about that, but at the same time, the right thing to do is challenge it. And this board does have, you know, that previous MFL out there, or, you know, that previous recommendation regarding the MFL that we could, you know, go on the back of and say, okay, we've now seen what they're going to do. We think it's wrong for this reason, and basically almost it's based on this historical baseline argument, which is probably the best argument there is, since, you know, all this, you just get knee deep in all of these other arguments, you know, about the, you know, all the different ways you can look at the water, you know, what they call it, the water resource values, and just get lost in that argument. So, but the baseline is a simple one, you know, and I like that chart that Bob showed. That's a pretty good one. I had to look real closely though, Bob. It's very hard to see on over the monitor, even as close as you held it up. But I'm curious what your opinion is on that, doing, you know, to attacking the protection and recovery plan versus the MFL.
Well, if I can respond, Nisha, they're part of the same rule, David. So, you know, when this rule is finalized, it will contain both the science, both the MFL and the prevention and recovery strategies. It'll all be one rule. And if someone challenges it, either the county or an individual environmental group, they challenge the whole rule. And you could, you know, then pick and choose which arguments you want to make in terms of that challenge. I did say that the part of the regulatory strategy that we've seen does sound pretty good, but you can see from the document, Mark distributed the email earlier today that I sent to DEP back in December with my questions about the regulatory strategy. It sort of sounds okay on the surface, but there's a lot of questions about it, at least in my mind. And Stacy included some of those in their letter as well. So we'll have to see, but, you know, part of my concern would be that they come up with a regulatory strategy that sounds pretty good, but when they actually implement it, they use phony science to, you know, to cover their tracks. So they could say, well, you need to offset your pumping. And by the way, you know, if you stick a 1959 Chevrolet down in this sinkhole, that will generate, you know, 2 million gallons, you know, some nonsense analysis that will enable them to, in fact, meet the requirement for offsets. I mean, that's what happened in 2014. If you read the recovery strategy from 2014, it's not bad. And it actually did absolutely nothing. And I know if and when I'm involved with a group challenging this MFL, one of the first things we would get at in depositions would be, okay, Swanee River, explain to us how this recovery strategy that you finalized in 2015 worked, and show us how that reduced pumping or offset pumping. And the answer is it didn't. So yeah, that would be, David, what you're suggesting would require a lot of strategic thought by a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of groups that are maybe interested in challenging this. And you raised the right questions. Obviously, there's no answer at this point, but we went through it with the rainbow. You know, there were long discussions between the lawyers and RRC Inc. and others about if to challenge and how to challenge, and that would be a process that would occur down the road.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and hopefully you'd be available to make some recommendations or to give us some strategy, points when we get around to doing that. For what it's worth, this board would have to physically meet in order to make any proposal, you know, of recommendation to the county. And I don't know about anyone else. I'm willing to take my life in my hands, put a mask on, and come to a meeting, you know, to do that. And perhaps we should consider doing that, but that's up to Tanisha and everyone else on the board to decide. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Go ahead, Bettina, and then Scott after that. Bettina, if you have a question, You can unmute yourself and ask.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself. Yeah. So to Bob's information, I really like that. I also, as I listened to all of you and all these discussions, I was wondering, okay, so what can we do as EPAC? And I really like Bob's suggestion, that we perhaps should recommend to the county to challenge the MFLs. But honestly, I feel like that poor judge you were talking about, I definitely have very little expertise. And it seems like that even those of you who are very well versed with this topic agree that it's very challenging to describe the dynamics of springs and water flow, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering if, Bob, if you would be able to be our advisor. I think that would be really fantastic. And I second David's suggestion. I'm very willing to meet in person and, to work on a recommendation for the county. And I don't know how involved that recommendation has to be, because you thought it takes a lot of time, but I kind of envision, just a simple letter. So I may be naive again here. But yes, I also would like to make a recommendation to the county and meet. That's all I want to say.
Nisha, could I quickly say, first of all, I'm happy to
Sure.
advise in any way I can on this. Like I said, it's quite complicated. But on the other hand, I think it's in the district and DEP's interest to make things look complicated. And the graph I showed earlier is real simple, and it's also very definitive. And in the case of the rainbow, it was clear that historic flows in the rainbow were down 20%. And the question is why? The district said it was all rainfall patterns. Dr. Knight and other experts said, no, a lot of it's pumping. And that's where the judge threw up his hands and said, I can't decide on the science. But I do think it's in the district interest to make things as complicated. And I think we need to guard against ourselves saying, oh, it's so hard, it's so hard. It's not that hard. I think they've done a great job of not showing the data in the MFL. As I mentioned, there's no data there on long-term flows, which you think would be the first thing they put in an MFL, and it's conspicuously absent. I'm also a little distrustful when the districts say, we're studying X, Y, and Z. I saw recently something out of Swanee that they're studying now, doing, I think, more intensive study on the relation of flows and algal growth. And we made the argument in Rainbow that noxious algae affect every one of those 10 water resource values. And algae is increased when flow is decreased. And therefore, lowered flow means every one of those resource values is affected because of the increase in algae. I noted that Swanee now is funding studies on that. And I'm cynical enough to think they're doing that because they're preparing themselves for a legal challenge when somebody's going to make that argument about flow and algae. And they're going to throw up their hand and say, hey, we're studying it. And the judge will say, hey, they're studying it. That's good enough for me. I would point you all to the recent op-ed that Scott's daddy wrote within the last month about the relation of flow and algae and the health of the Crystal River. And I went down the Crystal River a few weeks ago, and it's magnificent. The eelgrass, there's enough eelgrass there to feed every manatee in the state of Florida. And Dr. Knight talked about it in his op-ed. And what's the reason? And Crystal River's been horrible for years in terms of eelgrass growth. And the reason is flow is up. We've had a lot of rain and flow is up, and it's washed out all that crap. And the eelgrass has come back beautifully. So the basis of a healthy, at least in that case, healthy springs is good flow. That's the bottom line. That's key to all the water resource values.
Scott, do you want to ask?
Yeah, no, I mean, The thing actually I really focus in on that you were talking about, Bob, was I'm happy to hear that you're pushing a proposal to quantify benefits in all of these projects that are being completed. It's something that we have discussed for a very long time, how there's very little accountability for so many of these projects that are being funded to especially improve water quality. But I think you have exactly the same issues in terms of water quantity. So I just wanted to say that was news to me and very interesting to hear.
Well, it's kind of interesting was I mentioned Ryan Smart, whom a lot of you know is executive director of the Florida Springs Council. And Ryan and I were chatting, I don't know, it's a year ago, 6 months ago. And there's this blue-green algae task force, which Governor DeSantis created. And they issued a report. There's a couple of University of Florida professors on it. And they issued a pretty good report on how to deal with the blue-green algae crisis in Florida. And we noted that basically none of those recommendations were acted on by the legislature or the governor. So Ryan and I, after a couple of beers one night, said, well, why don't we just write a piece of legislation that incorporates every one of those recommendations? And so we did, and we called it the Ron DeSantis Blue-Green Algae Task Force Implementation Act, which was kind of a snotty title to the bill, and went up to Tallahassee with it and got a couple people to introduce it, although they removed DeSantis's name. So it was just called the Blue-Green Algae Task Force Implementation Act. And a lot of the really good provisions we put in there that were recommended by the task force got stripped out. I think we had somewhere between 8 and 10 sections of the bill. We're now down to 3 provisions out of the original 8 to 10. But one of the 3 is the one you referenced, Scott, is accountability for anything over $1 million. So we'll see if it survives. It's definitely going to pass the Senate. We need to get it through the House. And I have the number here somewhere. Go ahead, everybody, somebody else talk while I look up the number of the bill. Well, here it is. It's Senate Bill 832. And it's passed, I think, 2 committees already, and it's going to be heard in appropriations probably next week.
If I could, I can speak to the budget that Bob mentioned. I mean, I definitely in the EPD budget do not have budget for a lawsuit. I mean, I have a little bit of money that I'm holding on to in case I need to hire a consultant to help again in this next phase in this year. It's not lawyer money, that's for sure. I have heard past commissioners talk about a challenge we've had transition on our board. I don't, our budget typically doesn't work that they're holding on to money places, but there are reserves and there are, there are budgets in places, and how something like this would work. I believe EPAC was involved in, the county did get involved legally with challenging the mine up in Union and Bradford County. So our legal team has been working on that, and then they hired some consultants. So, they did intervene in that. So typically something like this, our attorney's office would get involved. I mean, they would obviously keep EPD looped in. I mean, I would still be a part of it, but I would not be, driving that bus because, I still have my workload and I am not an attorney.
I'm not either, by the way, Stacy. Just play one in the movies.
And I see that comment. So that's your motion from before, and was that about this MFL revision?
This was about this MFL revision, which has been going on for several years now. It did look back to the 2014, but it also said, where we're at the time. To look at the data on this, or I may have skipped that line just because it's already going to take you 3 pages. Let me see the original. This was on June 10th, 2019.
This was a recommendation that we put forward as a board, or?
Yes, we formally
Okay.
sent this to the commission on June 10th, 2019, or soon thereafter, like within a day or two after that. I'll send a copy of the, in a PDF.
Yeah, would
so I can
you?
send a copy of that.
It's tricky to read the whole thing in the chat box.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I should have
Yeah,
done that before.
I mean, I'm looking here too at some of the attachments that were included with the agenda for today's meeting. And it looks like, I mean, like this February 2020 letter from Chris Bird from the Alachua County EPD director, or is he still the director?
He was at that
He
time.
was,
but
okay.
And these were all my letters. We just send them from the director.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so yeah, so Stacy's letter. I mean, it expresses a lot of concerns around the MFL, and then also the letter from December 2021 with concerns, very specific things that that y'all saw as needing clarification or revision in the regulatory strategy. So I guess my question or my feedback related to all of this is, you know, as a board, you know, I'd want to be kind of on the same page, hopefully, as Alachua County EPD, and not, you know, recommending something to the county that EPD thinks might not be the best course of action. I mean, we could, of course, always have differences of opinion, but you know, ideally, we're all kind of like thinking the same way about it. And I don't know where EPD stands. You just said you don't have like lawyer money sitting around, but you know, potentially the commission has, you know, something if it's really worth going down that road. And then with respect to this regulatory strategy letter that you wrote, do you like, how does this work when you write a letter with these concerns? Do you get direct feedback from them? Is it possible that they'll revise the regulatory strategy based on this feedback, or is it just kind of just there for you to kind of make your case?
I think it's possible that some things can be considered. I mean, some things, you know, I don't think will be. I mean, you'll see number 5 in the February letter, you know, we're getting at that public interest also, kind of that same stuff Bob was talking about with the consumptive use permitting. You know, we do not get a response where they speak to these things. They do sometimes do a response, like a general response to public comments, but a lot of times it's a very kind of boilerplate response to your comments. So it's possible they'll get incorporated. You know, at this point in time, you know, EPD has not been recommending a challenge. There's nothing to challenge yet, but at some point, you know, there becomes a time crunch, right? That you'd want to start preparing for something like that. You know, like Bob, I mean, I've watched all of these challenges before. One has not really been won yet, but that doesn't mean that it can't be. So it's difficult to make that recommendation, right? Because it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, and sometimes challenges slow things down. So if we do see a regulatory plan and recovery strategy that we feel like is good, I wouldn't want to be recommending that we challenge, because then we're going to slow it down. Even though I'm sure whatever they come out with, I will find fault with and have suggestions as how it could be better. But in light of past cases, if I don't feel like we have high chances of winning, is the best path to move forward with, you know, whatever they come out with. And maybe we put our eggs in other baskets, you know, if there's a role for the county in what the Springs Council is doing with looking at consumptive use permitting, because that's really at the root of all of this, right? Is all of that consumptive use. So, you know, I've been debating in my mind, like, what is the best way to get at it? We need reduced use. How do we get there? And I don't feel ready. I don't feel like I can make that decision quite yet as to what my personal recommendation is. And I obviously would have to work with other people in my group and Stephen, our current director.
Casey, I can quickly comment on that. That's a really good point. We have a challenge into the Five Springs B maps, and those were issued in 2018, and this is still in the courts. And we started out with, I think, 7 groups and 3 individuals challenged these B maps. But a lot of those established groups like Wakulla Springs Alliance and Wekiva, Friends of the Wekiva, decided not to challenge their B map for the very reason Stacy said. And when we lost the case and we're now in the appeals court, one of the five B maps we challenged is now out of that challenge because actually it was the Wekiva group in this case decided, that they didn't want to prolong the process any longer. So what Stacy's saying is very real. And, you guys would have to look, and the county would have to look at not only the MFL, but also all the strategies and make that assessment Stacy just described. Is it worth the risk of slowing up what might be not the best, but something halfway decent? Not that I'm saying it's halfway decent yet. I'm not convinced of that, but you're right. That's a very good consideration. And just ballpark figure, I think the Rainbow case probably cost us $125,000 to $150,000. The BMAP challenge, probably more than that. And we were lucky that we had a lot of free help. The lead attorney in the Rainbow challenge was pro bono. Our major witness, Dr. Knight, was pro bono. And it still runs up into hundreds of thousands of dollars. So these are not trivial in terms of the work, the effort, the analysis, and also the money. These are not trivial challenges.
Right. And I don't think the county will be successful in getting pro bono. Just because we've got the deeper pockets, but maybe.
Right. Yeah. Well, Dr. Knight came to you and said, I'm willing to be part of the team pro bono. I don't think you'd throw him out.
I have some
David
comments.
and then Melissa.
Yeah, I disagree that we should follow exactly what EPD does. We don't have the same limitations they do and the same obligations they do. We also do not necessarily have to consider the financial aspect of this. What we do have to consider is whether we think it's something worth moving forward on. And certainly the idea that it could take several years to slow the process down, that is something we can consider. I think that is within, the realm of something we consider. But at the same time, if you look at the graph again and you consider, they keep letting it go down and go down. I mean, this is just going to let it go down more. The level is going to go down more. And so whether you do the next time, 5-10 years from now, it's going to go down further again. Or they're going to readjust the MFL like they did so that they could just say, okay, now it's out of recovery and prevention. When in reality, I don't think it's changed, that much. I think if anything, it's gone down slightly. I think that's what the representation, that the data showed when I looked at it. But, I mean, that's something that we can consider in the next few months. We've still got some time, I think, to look at this. And I think we should make up our own mind what we think is the right thing to do, what we think the right recommendation is at that time, and then move forward with it. And it doesn't have to be based upon what anyone else is doing. It's based upon what we as a group, think is the right thing to do. And I would go for a consensus, vote on something like that, which is how we've done everything in the past. Either everyone's all for it or we back off, from what we're recommending until we get something that everyone agrees upon.
And I will
Thank
say,
Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
I was just going to add, just with timing, that we are in the process of I'm really evaluating a lot of what we're doing in the water resources program. I did 2 jobs for a couple of years and now I'm only doing 1. So it's amazing. So really a lot of things just got backed up. And so I'm really looking at, okay, what's working, what isn't, what do we want to do? We're looking at making some code changes. And, you know, I think we're gonna be doing some big picture. We've got some commissioners that are really interested in water conservation. So, you know, I hear this discussion and I know where it may end up. And it's helpful for me to hear as, you know, when we have some of those discussions, our legal team is getting brought in because some of the things that, you know, we're asking to do, we need legal help to push them. And, you know, I will continue to bring up this concept, you know, what do we think we get from challenging the MFL? What would we get, you know, if we somehow challenged a consumptive use permit or something like that? So this is really good timing as we evaluate, you know, what else can we do to protect the river and springs? So.
Can I make one final idea thought there? It is, you know, in some extent, what makes us a very useful body is that we can back up the commission's you know, will to move in a given direction. You know, we can give them support and they can say, yes, well, now we didn't do this alone. You know, we had recommendations from this committee or this committee over here. And, you know, that was something that we took into consideration when we made our decision. So to some extent, you know, we should be basing this also on what direction the commission wants to go with this. And so, you know, we can talk to them directly one by one and discover where they want to go with this and, you know, what they would like to see us recommend to them. Okay, so I think that's always a factor. We can talk to them about what facts we've gotten, and, you know, Stacy can be talking to them about that. But when it comes time to make that recommendation, we can also be saying, you know, just what does the commission want to do? And we can, you know, give them, you know, perhaps a little nudge in going in the direction they want to go in anyway.
Thanks, David. I just want to clarify, in case it wasn't clear what I was saying earlier. I don't think that we necessarily need to follow what the will of the EPD. I was just saying that, you know, in the ideal case, we're both on the same page, so we can be more, you know, efficacious when we're making recommendations. And, you know, it's just always nice to be on the same page with, you know, kind of the people who are also looking out for the environment from another angle. So that's all I was saying there. And I also, you know, obviously they sit and do this stuff as their job, as their career. So like Stacy's thinking about this kind of stuff all day long. And I definitely want to heavily consider what people like Stacy have to say when it comes to these kinds of issues. So that's all I was trying to say with my comment.
You know what happens, Nisha? In the end, we modify what EPD wants to do, and they modify what we want to do, and then we all end up agreeing on. You know, guys, that's happened enough times that I can say that seems to be kind of a common thread.
Yeah. Let's go ahead. I know you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, hey. So we have had a very robust and lengthy discussion. So I want to circle back. Stacy, for the presentation that you gave, you said kind of at the beginning of it that this is something that you will be giving to county commissioners and making those recommendations in terms of kind of what regulatory actions you want to make in comment for the MFL and recovery plan. Is that correct? Was that the intent of the presentation and those ideas in there? Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so this presentation I did give to the Joint Water Climate Policy Board, which is 3 county commissioners, 3 city commissioners, and then 1 commissioner from the outlying communities. I am due to get the full county commission involved with the MFL, but I've kind of, you know, been waiting for that last piece because it's going to be difficult for them to wrap their brain around all of it. So I don't want to have to like present it and then they're like, what's your recommendation? Well, let's wait and see what they come out with. And then 3 months later, I come and I have to remind them the whole thing again of what this all means. But I have a feeling it's going to all of a sudden come quickly when the document comes out or recommendations come out. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know that they have to have a prevention and recovery plan as part of the MFL. That's what they did last time. But now that they're doing, you know, this rulemaking in chunks, it's possible that they'll have some stuff in that. It's not 100% clear to me. So Melissa, that was not a clear answer to you. Eventually, and I would think it would be this year, 2022, I feel I need to update the Board of County Commissioners about what's happening with this MFL. And, when that happens, I need to have some staff recommendations, right? I can't just give them the information and just walk away. They hire me so that I can have, this is what EPD thinks should be done. And then that would probably be a useful time to know, this is what EPAC thinks should be done. And then we see what those commissioners think should be done. But really the only actions are that we provide comments like we've continued to do, but we can also do a board letter, a chair letter that maybe that has a little more weight. I'm not sure that it does. I think action would be some type of political challenge, or maybe projects that we do or policies that we do to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to at least reduce use in Alachua County. But right, it's not like the county commission has to approve this MFL.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to clarify on that. And I know it's a loose timeline, and when things come out, they tend to move quickly with short comment periods if there are comment periods available. In terms of what this board decides to recommend and, move forward with supporting or backing, it sounds to me like collectively as a group, there are gaps in what we understand in this process and the data behind it. So I think before any sort of recommendation that EPAC would want to make, whether that is supporting a legal challenge or just recommendations to the MFL and what we think the Board of County Commissioners should support or not support, it seems like collectively as a group, we could use some more education on this as a whole. So I'll just chime that in as my 2 cents.
Yeah,
Thanks, Melissa.
I'll put a link in the chat to where all Sawani's documents are, in case that's helpful.
That'd be great.
Just if I
Yeah.
could quickly follow up on what Stacy said, not only is it true that the county commission doesn't have to approve the MFL, it's also true the water management districts do not have to approve the rule. This rule is approved by DEP. So, probably any correspondence ought to be going to DEP. They're the ones driving the bus here. And that's true because it's a cross water management district MFL. Involves more than one of them.
But it's
Didn't
so
they agree
tricky
last
because the
time?
district is doing the technical work. And then,
Yeah.
it's like I've been dealing with district staff forever. And I will say, in defense, our water management district has some great staff that I think really do want to protect the resources. They're limited within the structure that they have to work within.
Well, they don't want to get fired for one thing.
There's that.
Well, with that in mind, Bob, I have to ask, have you seen a case where the district refuted a decision on the department from an MFL perspective? I mean,
No.
so, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I've seen, the Rainbow case was not a DEP rule. It was a Southwest Florida.
That was Swift Mud, yeah.
That was Swift Mud. So I don't know of other MFLs that have been, multi-district that have been ultimately decided by DEP. There probably are some maybe in South Florida. I'm just not aware of them, Mark.
And it's interesting that it's going through DEP, but because I have such a hard time, I can't really find any documents on their website about this MFL. I can just find the rule announcements and that's it.
Yeah, I tried to make a comment after that last meeting we attended, Stacy. You were there in person, I was Zooming in, but they made a big point of here's where you go to the link and you can make comments. And I went there and you couldn't make a comment, so. It was a great black hole.
Maybe they figure they got it all figured out and don't need any comments from anyone else.
I reckon, yeah, I reckon.
Well, I have to admit, coming from the Southwest up here and seeing DEP's role in this is a little disconcerting. I mean, the expertise, are at the water management districts, and the department it's just kind of always, refer to them and their decisions, but yet you look at this from an administrative and legal perspective, the department's one making some pretty big decisions here. And then it becomes an issue whether district governing boards willing to say, concur with staff's recommendation that, which doesn't necessarily agree with the board, and then how all this comes together or not, in an administrative hearing. I think it's going to be interesting to be a fly on the wall to see how that, comes about. But obviously, as we all know, there's a lot of politics in this. And so, we'll see.
There's one case, Mark, that kind of touches on what you asked. It just occurred to me, and that was Silver River MFL. And the St. John's district staff initially rejected a permit application from Frank Stronach for X gazillion gallons a day. And then out of nowhere, they decided they had a new model, and they reran all the data and decided that everything was fine, and issued and recommended issuance of the permit. And that kind of fits into the theme that I haven't studied this, but some of the veterans around here that know the water management districts and the politics better than I do. The general theme that the water management districts have been stripped of power, money, resources over the last decade or so, and things have gotten much more centralized through DEP, which means they're much more run from Tallahassee than they were a decade or two ago. So I think that agrees with what you were getting at, I think. And part of it's reflected, by the way, in the makeup of the water management district governing boards. And I know when the current governor came in, the Springs Council organized a very strong effort to get some scientists and environmental advocates on the governing boards of various water management districts. I myself nominated myself in the St. John's district. I kind of live right on the border, but my house is in St. John's. So I put in an application to get on that board. Dr. Knight applied to get on the board as well. We had about 10, reasonably good candidates to be governing board members on the water management districts. And all these candidates had significant scientific or environmental credentials. Needless to say, none of us were selected by the governor. And it remains pretty much a club for, by and large, people representing industries or companies that utilize water, that exploit water, that profit from water. That tends to be who's on these boards, with one or two minor exceptions.
Well,
And
yeah, you're right. And what's surprising is even if there's board members there, in the case of St. John's, they had board members leave and DeSantis would not reappoint. And they've reached a point where they didn't have enough to make quorum to approve project applications. And
not only that, we threw a lawsuit over that. And we threatened an action that they couldn't take any budgetary decisions. They couldn't pay salaries. They couldn't do anything. And this was the Springs Council. We basically, I think, panicked DeSantis into quickly appointing some people.
Right.
Because he was on, I won't even say shaky legal grounds. He was on quicksand.
Oh, yeah.
They had no legal right to do anything.
Yeah.
And, we had op-eds and everything else, and they quickly appointed 2 or 3 friendly faces.
Well, it's been a super interesting discussion tonight, and yeah, I know I have a lot to think about. I think everyone else does, and I liked Melissa's suggestion that we continue to educate ourselves. Stacy left a link in the chat with of the Swanee River is it the Water Management District's website, Stacy? Okay. But I also know, you know, for myself, and I think it applies to some of the other members, you know, when we log out of Zoom and kind of go on with our daily lives, we forget to follow up and do the research in the interim between, you know, now and the next meeting. So I think it would be good to have a follow-up, you know, to revisit this subject in subsequent meetings as well as, you know, offline. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there if it made sense to invite someone back, not necessarily next meeting, but you know, at some point in the near future, so we can continue to educate ourselves on this subject and like Bob said, you know, kind of decide where we stand and how much, how proactive we want to be and where we want to put our efforts with respect to the MFL and other, you know, the avenues of supporting, you know, responsible water use and all of that. So, yeah, with that said, does anybody have anything else before the meeting ends that they wanted to share, anything coming up, or topics that they want to maybe discuss at future meeting? No?
We
Okay.
do need to consider whether, you know, whether we're going to, or what our next topic for a community conversation will be. So.
Our next subject for the next meeting or the community conversation? Which one did you say?
Well, we can put that in our next meeting. We can do a community conversation discussion in the next meeting. We should do that along with discussing this for the next several meetings. And Mark can accomplish that, to making sure it's in the agenda until we ask him to remove it. So.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. I know we talked about the vulnerability assessment, the climate change vulnerability assessment. I don't know what the status on that is, or if it makes sense to have somebody come talk to us about that. And then what a follow-up to tonight's discussion would look like, who we could invite to come back and discuss more with us.
I'm sure we can get Bob to talk more about it. So. I think we all need to read more, though. We all need to read quite a bit.
Yeah, we do. And Mark, do we have anything that you're aware of for next month's agenda so far?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
Something that you might want to consider that as a follow-up, sounds like the Springs Council is doing some legal work with consumptive use permits, which obviously is tied to the MFL. I wonder if it makes sense to see if Ryan Smart from the Florida Springs Council, you know, would be interested in kind of sharing some of his thoughts and potentially even on the MFL side of it too. Because I mean, he's considered it, and I think he's been involved with some of those challenges.
Okay.
I can ask him. I've communicated with him a number of times before.
Oh, that'd be great, David. All right, so cool. We'll see if we can get Ryan on. And then any other suggestions? Bob, you're always welcome to come back.
I appreciate all of the feedback and the questions. I apologize that I was not fully prepared. I have not had time to dive back into the MFL. So I want to thank Scott for having my back on some of that. So thank you.
It takes at least two to understand any portion of it.
Yeah, I feel like even if I understood it, I would just get really tongue twisted trying to explain it to people, and there's a lot of nuance that you have to put into your communication as well. So yeah,
Scott, that's why I keep saying Scott and George are our greatest treasures here. They can explain it clearly.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, it's about 8 o'clock, so why don't we wrap up, and then hopefully we'll have Ryan next month, and you know, more interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for hosting.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Night,
Good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Right.